it was never the intent of Catholic Christianity to be a catacomb church. The
No,
catacomb was a result of persecutions. As soon as we were able to get our footing, and we saw Constantine become friendly towards us, and eventually Constantine was baptized. Circumstances are muddy and cloudy, but from that moment on up until Justinian and then the Byzantine Empire, and then we see the Frankish kingdom and the Spaniards, and we see, the Anglo-Saxon kings. All of this is an extension of Christ the King. All of these monarchs, and of course there were difficulties in all of these regimes and tension with the church. But there was the idea that they bent the knee and were submitted to Christ the King, and the laws themselves should conform to the gospel. And it really wasn't until the turn of the last century, the 1900s, when we see this whole thing collapsing. And is this what triggers the Fatima apparition? Is this Our Lady, the mother, getting off the throne next to her son, Christ the King, and coming down and preparing us for this complete collapse of everything that was Christendom?
that's why she came in the year 1917,
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of World War I, to say that this war would end soon. But in the midst of that war, you had the collapse of the last monarchy of Christian Europe. The House of Habsburg was basically destroyed, and the emperor abdicated, but not really. He simply renounced his rule, and Wilson insisted upon this as a condition of peace. Europe was carved up like a Christmas turkey, and that gave birth to the nationalism that made Hitler possible,
Right.
and the Second World War. And she came to warn that there would be a worse war when the First World War ended if men did not change their ways. And what did she call for in 1917? The consecration of Russia, the first Saturday communions of reparation, and other devotions, and of course prayer and penance. But the consecration of Russia would be the key transformative historical event that would reverse the developments that were then underway. Antonio Socci says that if it were done by the Pope in union with all of the world's bishops, it would bring about a victory greater than the one at Lepanto.
Mm.
And a reversal, he said, an overthrow, actually, is the word he used, capovolto, of the mentality dominating modernity. That would be a miraculous development. But then the emergence of Christendom was a continuous miracle.
Right.
What we're talking about here is the unity of church and state, not in the sense that you have a Vatican sanitation department or a Vatican police department in every country, but rather there's an organic link between the two powers. Each power operates in its own sphere, but there's a connection between the two. This goes back all the way to 494. Where Pope Gelasius writes to the Emperor Anastasius and talks about what is called the Galatian diarchy. It's a fancy term for two powers that rule in the state. There are two powers, he wrote to the emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled: the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. And of these, he said, that of the priests is the more weighty. Well, that's been completely overthrown and abolished in political modernity. And Our Lady comes to talk about the consecration of Russia and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart. What does that mean? It means Russia, she says in the apparition of July 13th, will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. A nation will be converted. That means a corporate conversion to Christ the King, not just individuals professing faith in Christ, not just individual Christians practicing Christianity in their private way, but a national conversion, which will bring about a transformation of the entire global political scene. It will be a miraculous occurrence, not unlike the development of Christendom in the first place, from the catacombs to all of the Western world. So that's what the message of Fatima is all about. And unfortunately, because of the new orientation of the church since the 1960s, the message has been buried in its authenticity. And this is why I refer to the false friends of Fatima. They want to reduce the message of Fatima to just a call for prayer and penance by you, the individual. Go in your prayer closet, pray, and do a lot of penance. Now, of course, prayer and penance are essential, but they want to reduce the message to just that. It's a generic prescription for prayer and penance, but Our Lady had a lot more to say about that than prayer and penance. Prayer and penance was necessary, she said, not just for our own personal advancement in the spiritual life, and for our own personal salvation, but for the salvation of entire nations. And if her prescriptions were not followed, she said, including, above all, the consecration of Russia, then Russia would spread its errors throughout the world. The good will be martyred. There will be wars and famines. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. And various nations will be annihilated. The annihilation of nations. So there's not only a prophecy about prayer and penance, but a warning and basically a heavenly ultimatum. Do this or else. And it hasn't been done. You cannot consecrate Russia without mentioning Russia. And every ceremony attempted since the message of Fatima was revealed to the world by the Blessed Virgin has conspicuously avoided the mention of Russia, especially during the reign of John Paul II, who reportedly asked whether he could mention Russia and was told by his advisors, I think it was during the 1982 attempt or the 1984 attempt, I forget which one, no, you cannot mention Russia. We cannot provoke the Russians by mentioning them.
Which is counterintuitive because in our theology, when a person is baptized in the Eastern or Western rites, you name the person. If we're going to consecrate Russia, folks, I know there's some people out there who maybe aren't convinced on this yet. You have to say the name Russia.
Well, consecration is the setting aside of a thing for a sacred purpose. How can you set aside a thing for a sacred purpose if you refuse to mention its name?
Yeah.
And how do you consecrate Russia in a ceremony from which the name of Russia is specifically, for political reasons, excluded? I had a running joke about this. When you look at all these different ceremonies, the entrustment of the world, the entrustment of humanity, the sick, the unemployed, everything was being entrusted to Mary. I said, why don't they just have a ceremony in which they consecrate everything in the world, absolutely, except Russia? Because that's the way it was. It was a process of deliberately avoiding the one thing that had to be done. And so, although there are benefits, obviously, that flow from any such prayer by a pope, any such entrustment of a certain subject to the Blessed Virgin and her intercession, it will not, as Sister Lucia said, bring about the conversion of Russia. Now, we're seeing some interesting developments in Russia today, but those are along the lines of what I believe to be yet another instrumentalization of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Eastern Orthodoxy, although they have valid sacraments, and they're not in communion with Rome, they're obviously schismatics, has been compromised since the time of the Russian Revolution. It was reduced to an instrument of the state. And so it submits itself to the dictates of the state. Even now, that's the case. And while the Orthodox Church is being instrumentalized for nationalist purposes, we can at least look at that as a kind of preparation for what will happen when the consecration is finally done. There was a prophetic poet, philosopher, sort of guy named Soloviev, writing at the turn of the 20th century in 1900, who predicted a massive conflict between the East and the West, during which there would be a reunification of the Eastern Church with Rome, and then there would be a triumph in the new unified church, which would be centered upon Rome. This was a kind of anticipation of the prophecy of Fatima and the ultimate triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I mean, these are real things that will happen in the real world. People have forgotten that grace is real and that the miracle of grace, which is Christendom, can happen again. And we're seeing signs of it elsewhere. We're seeing signs of it in Hungary, which adopted a Christian constitution in 2012, explicitly invoking the name of St. Stephen I, who converted Eastern Europe. And we're seeing it in Poland, a great revival there of the idea of a Christian state. Unfortunately, the Vatican sets itself up in opposition to these developments and tries to denounce them as nationalism and populism, as if it were the return of Hitler, which is an incredibly perverse development in the Vatican diplomacy. And this is accompanied, of course, by the complete sellout of the underground church in China. So the butchers of Beijing, as I call them.